Hey everyone, this is the Legislative Review Committee meeting on Wednesday, August 2nd to the City Hall, 301B, and we are ready to start our meeting. We have Commissioner Allison Wright and Avita Thornton with us, and are expecting Commissioner John Culpepper and Jesse Poole to join us within the next few minutes. We'll move on to get the agenda started and see if there's a motion to approve the minutes from June 1st.
So moved. I'll second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Since there's no one here from the public, I assume we do not have any public input. And then, there's a B and a C there. It's very confusing, but we're going to move on. I think that was a typing error here or formatting. Move on to the two items today, which are the review and update of the neighborhood traffic management program, which will then be followed by a review of the Chapter 4 animal control ordinance that we've been looking at. So we just did that, and so I'll turn this over to our assistant manager, Nikki Jones, and welcome Commissioner Poole.
Thank you. So the mayor placed into the committee the neighborhood traffic management program. He wanted us to review and update it. So at the last meeting, we reviewed the material that the commission saw in February, but we also reviewed a CDO that came in May as well. Specifically, we reviewed the types of traffic calming measures. We also reviewed some history. So I believe the history goes back to 1999. So staff was able to talk about all these different things. And where we left it was we would come to you with something like a framework. And today staff is going to be prepared to present a bit of a framework. Nothing's etched in stone. What we're really looking for is some input from y'all. We can answer a ton of questions because I think it's worthy of questioning right now. We have a very specific model that we've been using. We think it's been working okay. Certainly, it can be improved, but I'll turn it over to staff and they'll present it.
Yeah. Sarah, do you have the presentation?
I do. We also have a visitor.
Yes, yeah. While we get this going, I do want to welcome John Hawkins here, who's with us through our video conferencing, and he has just rejoined the attorney's office staff. So welcome, John.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Okay.
Is that it? Sherelle's going to jump in.
The volume was a little low.
Okay.
So glad to be here.
Okay.
Sherelle's going to give most of this presentation today, kind of talking through the data-driven model. And just a reminder, last time we met, you asked us specifically to show you an example of what a data-driven model for neighborhood traffic management would look like. I think we really got most of the way there with what we're going to show you today. But just a reminder, this is not a final, like Nikki said, it's not the final set in stone version. We really want your input, and just know that this is just an example of what something like this would look like.
Yeah, and we've identified some of the pinch points that we feel like we're not sure if we can answer, but of course, if you have other things, please point them out as I'm presenting, and I will do my best to answer, or Stephen will jump in. But yeah, if you want to. So we're going to give a very brief background in the challenges that led us here, and then I'm going to walk you guys through the model and kind of the geospatial analyses that I did to get us where we are, and then we'll have hopefully a lot of time at the end for us to point out the issues that we see and the problems that we need y'all to answer and to discuss next steps. So just as a reminder of why we're here, the mayor's charge was to review and update the neighborhood traffic management program. So that's why we're here today. And one of the main challenges that brought us to trying out a data-driven approach was that the traditional approach of someone calling and saying, hey, our neighborhood, it has a speeding problem. Can you help us? It involved many steps and correspondence and time for our study staff members to go out into the field and collect data and coordinate with people. And as the program becomes more and more popular, it became more and more burdensome to the point that last year there were far more people asking for help than we had the capacity to address. So we had to, for the first time, try to prioritize projects, which wasn't something we'd done before. And we brought that forth to you guys, and there was that list of projects, which I can bring back up if we need it later, but that's kind of where we're at now. And so we were like, well, that's a very cumbersome way to do it. What if would you all like me to stand up there so you don't have to go back and forth?
I think that's helpful, so we can have.
Sure.
And as Drill starts talking about the methodology, also a reminder, so yes, it was a burden on staff, but also a request-driven system also lacks a lot of the equity pieces that, we're looking for with the data-driven system. So it's sort of the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right?
That was similar, years ago with the sidewalk.
Exactly. Sidewalk
Remember?
requests. Yeah. Yes.
So, and not only was it a burdensome on staff, but it was very burdensome on the neighborhoods to have to gather that many people and get everyone to agree on something and get those petitions signed. And really, when it comes back to equity, the person who has the most capacity to gather all those signatures and get people together, they maybe don't have to work, or they have the resources. And so maybe the communities that needed it the most, maybe those people don't have the resources to be able to jump through all the hoops. And so maybe they're not getting what they need. So this is kind of a way of saying, let's take out the squeaky wheel, just look at the data and see where we need to address speeding issues on neighborhood streets. So we started with all of the streets in Clarke County. And then we selected just the ones that are classified as local, which is all of these.
Yellow.
So we have a lot of local streets. And then,
So what's your definition of local?
so that is a GDOT roadway classification. So you've got your major arterials, your collectors, your local streets. And that encompasses a broad range of streets.
So are you saying there's some local GDOT streets? Isn't it either local or GDOT?
The classification system is based on how GDOT classifies them. So they are owned by us. All the local streets are owned by Athens and owned and maintained by us. But that classification system based on
Or UGA or.
Right.
Can you go back to the yellow?
Yeah.
Red, yellow, black. Okay, so we were all black and now the yellow is what you're calling the local.
Yes, and so this is, some of these are UGA streets, some of them are private. So the next round we'll filter out those.
Okay, and then right there, I could say the black ones are the GDOT.
Correct.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well,
There's
your
GDOT,
collectors aren't GDOT,
there's
are they?
GDOT, but there's also it's locally owned collectors.
Yeah, so for instance, MLK right here, that's our street, but it's not a local street.
It's a collector.
Yeah, or we a lot of these streets down in here, we own those.
Okay.
They're just not,
The
Classified.
categories.
they're,
Stations.
so an arterial, Atlanta Highway, Lexington, the Loop, those are arterials, they're the major streets. And then a collector would be Baxter, I believe is a collector.
Yep.
North Avenue, I believe is a collector.
Mhm.
So it's the collectors collect all of the local streets and then funnel them to the arterial. That's basically how.
But you asked a good question, because I asked a similar question yesterday as we were reviewing this. I was like, what exactly is a
Yeah.
local street? And we'll get to that.
Yeah.
We covered a lot of this in the quarter, pre-pandemic, I think.
I know honestly, it is confusing because sometimes the classifications don't exactly line up with what you think they should line up with too. So we're working on, as part of a different project, on trying to enhance our classification system to reflect land use. But that's a different story for another day.
Y'all might have said this earlier. What is Prince Avenue? It's a collector, right? Or is it GDOT?
Well, it's
GDOT.
GDOT, from millage on. but I believe it is a collector.
Right, and then it becomes a local road from Millage inward towards town.
But it's still a
Yeah,
collector.
Right.
Right, not that local, right?
I'm sorry, when I said in that term, it meant it's owned and maintained by Athens.
ACC road.
Yeah, but it's.
Which is why the technology just is so confusing.
Okay.
So, we then filtered by the ones that are just owned by TPW, right? We didn't want UGA roads, we didn't want private roads. We didn't want, any, sometimes Oklahoma roads slip into our system. We didn't want any of that. We just wanted TPW. And then we wanted the speed limit to be 25 or less, because only roads that are 25 miles per hour speed limit or less qualify. And then we filtered using this comprehensive data set that we have that has speeding and number of vehicles and all sorts of data for every single road in the county. So we use that, we pull that data in. And we filtered by ones that have at least 200 vehicles per day. The reason I did 200 and not 300 was it's a big data source and I just didn't want any to slip through the cracks by setting the threshold too high. And then anything that had an 85th percentile speed greater than or equal to 30, because 30 is our cutoff. And then this one's just local because I had to do this analysis twice and the screenshot is still showing a little bit fun. And then the next thing we did was we took our land use data, our parcel data, and we identified anything that was zone RS or RM. Now, neither Stephen nor myself are land use experts or planning experts, so we did the best we could given the chart that we had to identify residential uses, and we think it did a fairly good job of filtering out the ones that do not have residential land uses. So this is kind of all the ones that are yellow are the ones that were picked up as having residential land uses surrounding them. So a few dropped off by showing that they were not surrounded by residential land use.
Have you also applied that previous filter to this?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right, so we
So-
applied that, then, so we didn't see that one.
Oh, I'm sorry, did I not include that screenshot?
Yeah, okay, it's all right.
That's all right.
I just wanted to make sure I understood.
It's continuing to filter with each.
Yes, right,
criteria.
Yes.
One filter. So if you look at all of them, that's what the previous filter was. And then the yellow ones are the ones that this filter filters out.
What was the thing that you said before about 35 miles an hour?
30.
30.
So the qualifications to, for your street to participate in NTMP are 300 vehicles per day and greater than 30 miles per hour, 85th percentile speed.
In the 25 zone.
So you're meaning that people are going over
Yes.
30 miles per hour?
Yeah, so like the speed limit
85%, okay.
is 25 or less.
Yeah.
But people are going
Okay, that makes sense.
30 or more is their actual speed. So in the past, to collect actual speed, we would have had to have someone go out, lay down the counters and the ropes and the cameras and look through that footage, and it can take 12 plus hours to do all of that work to just get the speed. In this case, we used big data to tell us how fast people were going using connected vehicles and cell phones and other devices. They can triangulate speeds, and it's actually widely accurate.
Spooky.
Yeah.
It's
About that.
so the good news is connected vehicles have to opt in. You can't just like take their data. They opt into it. But I compared the connected vehicle data to our on the road data, and it was incredibly similar. So it actually does show, I think, great validity. There's lots of, scientifically validated research showing that it's valid, but I thought it was cool to see on our roads where our people are driving, the two do correlate.
Tell me the two categories again. You said the connected vehicle data versus the
Cell phone data.
cell phone data?
And so Streetlight doesn't, they used to use location-based services data, and now they just use connected vehicle data because of privacy concerns. So I believe all of this is connected.
And who is the they?
Streetlight.
is the name of one of the companies.
That's the name of the
Okay.
company that we used, yeah.
Not to be confused with our streetlights
Yeah.
taking
Yeah.
this data, just
I don't
want to
know
be
why they
clear.
chose that name for a
Yes,
company.
exactly.
that has nothing to do with
At least it's not called ACC Street Light.
Right.
Yeah.
So the company that we use to purchase this data
Mhm.
is called Streetlight. We no longer have a subscription to them. It was kind of the 6-month pilot
Mhm.
to have this data to be able to use to help us with some of our project prioritization and like land use planning, transportation planning.
Appreciate your use of the trial period.
When they're doing that though, they're making sure, I mean, all these things are filtered by the streetlight data. So 200 vehicles a day is still through the streetlight data, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
So speeding and volume are from Streetlight, and I'll get into more like what my inputs were. But yes, speeding and volume are Streetlight. Then we've got our parcel data, that's us, and our roadway classification that comes from GDOT. So those are kind of the things I put in here to filter which roads are we actually looking at. So you can see like it took it from, if you want to go back to that yellow, it took it from that all the way to this. And I believe this is 180 segments, but don't quote me on it.
Can you zoom in on that? Didn't it say? Just, no, you can't do that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We can get that to you.
yeah, I know, I have the thing in it.
Oh, wait, hold on. I want to go back. I might be able to.
I'm curious if any of those streets already have traffic management.
Oh, I was going to overlay it with our traffic management map. Steven, do you want to try to pull up our map, our NTMP map?
So we have to pull it up on Sarah's computer. I don't think she's got access.
Okay.
Probably.
See, I can see,
So-
I see what you're doing.
And as you know,
Yeah.
none of these streets do. I went through the list and fairly familiar with their traffic calming and then like stood out. But I will say, and we'll get into this later, some of them are flagged for this year's NTMP. So there is, we are identifying similar streets, not all the same streets, but for instance, Old Monroe right here is our #1 priority for the pilot NTMP. And it was ranked very highly on this as well. And then Saxon Woods, which is somewhere here, I think.
Like a weather. You're just like a weather point in the general direction.
So that one is also on here. Lombardi up here was on this year's NTMP, and it's also one of the highly ranked ones. So we
And
are.
that was based on all the pieces that you mentioned.
Yes, I'm about to. I can show you this slide if you want. Okay, sorry. So yeah, this is all the streets that fit every single one of those criteria, okay? And then we also wanted to include, as part of the prioritization framework, we were asked to include existing infrastructure given. So we pulled all of our sidewalk data, which is these light yellow lines. And then we said geospatial analysis, basically where you can see where two separate groups of lines overlap. And I identified all of those. And then this is one of those things where our data is not fantastic. We're working on making the data better, but we don't have a great knowledge of, okay, we know where generally our sidewalks are, but we don't necessarily know, are they fragmented? Like, do they cover the whole length of that segment or just a bit? Are they on both sides or one side?
And just a reminder that this is, all these pieces that we're talking about today are the same criteria that y'all voted on back earlier this year. When we looked at all that list of the requests, the NTMP requests from the past year, it's the same data-driven approach to figure out the criteria for this. So now it's just those exact same piece of criteria, but countywide.
Yeah.
And the sidewalks are, where we looked at the sidewalks,
Yes.
just as a reminder, because that's a place where people can walk safely.
That's-
So
That's right.
if a road doesn't have sidewalks, that makes it more a higher score.
Not having a sidewalk gives it exactly a higher score. So I had to go in and manually put this data in. There was no geospatial analysis that I could do with our current data that I do. So I had to manually look and see of the 49 that were highlighted that as having some sidewalk, what percentage of the road was covered in sidewalk.
Oh.
I answered the question? Okay. So then the next step was area disadvantage. And later I'll show you more specifically how that was calculated, but it's the same three factors you guys already voted on. Percent minority, percent receiving public assistance, and percent under 200% of the property line. So what I did here was called a spatial join, basically, where you can take, if, like, say a road overlaps two block groups, census tracts, sorry, you can average the score of the two census tracts that it overlays and give it to each segment. So each segment receives a score on area disadvantage.
Sherelle, so there's already an equity portion of the framework, right? And this is how we would look at
Yeah.
that.
So the framework that you guys voted on last time had those three indicators as part of it. Again, percent minority, percent below 200% of the poverty line, and percent receiving public assistance like SNAP. And those were already the three you were using. This was how I went ahead and did it in a big data way. So the way I did it last time, when there were like 26 streets to look at, I just went in manually and said, okay, this street is in this census tract, and I filled it in manually. This way, much faster, I just run a formula and it spits out a number for each of them. So it's a way of doing it a little bit faster, a little bit more systematic.
Yeah.
And then this is kind of the results. So we're looking at here, the average daily segment traffic, which means on average over a year's time frame, how many cars are driving on this road segment every day. So you can see Old Monroe is really high, Jennings Mill is really high, Lombardi, and now I'm losing my ability to name our streets, but you get the point.
Quick question. So I keep seeing the tiniest piece of Westchester there, which also has high traffic volume. Yeah. Why is it that instead of the whole road?
Sorry, I was just bringing it for you. Was trying to win it.
Maybe. This question?
Yeah.
So it's because only this met all of the requirements. So that it needed, all of the segments that are highlighted would need to have 300 vehicles per day and an 80-foot speed over 30 miles per hour. So if the whole road isn't highlighted, that's because it didn't meet the threshold.
So basically, somebody's riding down Westchester, and at that very last segment or that piece of the segment, they're speeding up or something like that.
The corner hill is what that is.
So this is a good piece of the conversation, I think, for how to actually operationalize this, because yes, we get very detailed into segments of roads versus entire roads in the analysis. But I think one of the questions to ask the group is, if we use this method, should we identify the segment that needs to be focused on, or do we take that segment and say, well, now let's expand and create an entire, like, a program for this whole neighborhood road, right?
Yeah.
So in the past, we've never had to do that because you'd have an entire neighborhood come in and say, hey, these are the streets in our neighborhood we want looked at. And if we'd run the on the ground data analysis on a number of those streets. But I think we have the option here. We can either focus on very, very small segments, or when we get to that project, expand it to be an entire.
Yeah, and you'll see later, I've shown you two different ways of ranking the segments that it kind of reflects that. Do we want to go with the highest segment and prioritize a neighborhood space on that? Or do we want to go the average over a length of a corridor that all qualifies and rank them based on that? And it does produce two different frameworks of rankings, but they're both, I think, valid, and hopefully we'll have a robust discussion about it.
I noticed that Lombardi, is there another Lombardi circle somewhere in Athens, or is there only one? Is that the one off of Freeman?
Yeah.
I'm really surprised at that one.
So this is,
Mm-hmm.
So it's Danielsville, I think.
But Danielsville would be on the other side, wait a minute, Lombardi. Oh, wrong thing.
I wish the names would pop up when you zoomed in, but it's
Okay.
comprehensive,
Okay.
so it doesn't.
Alright. Okay, no, it's okay.
Right next to JJ Harris.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, okay, I'm thinking something else, okay, good.
Cheryl, do we have, population density as any kind of, a factor in here?
We don't, but the closest thing to population density would just be how many people are driving down the street.
No, I was in a new section, and I think it's in there, of my, district, Riverbend Parkway, and the residents at the end, they weren't really concerned, I think it's right at that little stretch right there, but, they weren't really that, on the left side of the river. You can see, like, down there, right, that little piece right there, in there, and they weren't concerned about where they are, but they have to go through all these, apartments, you know, and they were concerned that they were basically gonna, like, be hitting people because it's dark, and there's something that
Well, there
you
was-
all know.
There was a gentleman who was.
There
killed
was a gentleman who was, right, and students, and there's a place where it's very dense. And so when I was talking to them, it was, like, the idea of density came into my mind because there are so many students walking down to the buses and so forth in that area. So I wanted to ask about the density of the population, if that's a factor.
It's not currently,
Okay.
but y'all make the rules, so if you want it to be, it certainly can be.
Right, we just took the criteria that had been voted on previously, but that
Mhm.
doesn't mean,
Yeah.
part of this discussion is that adequate or does it need to be revisited?
Yeah, so we made the original framework based on the original policy and operationalizing it. Prior to this year, we had never had to prioritize projects, so that piece of the policy was just never needed to be addressed. This was the first time we needed to prioritize because we didn't have the funds to cover all, I believe, 26 neighborhoods. So you guys voted on adding some additional criteria last time, which was the sidewalk infrastructure and crashes. So if you wanted to add more, we certainly could.
So I have a quick question. On this vehicle volume, is that similar? That's the whole volume versus the threshold being the 200 that you started with?
It is. And the reason, so when we go out and we do manual counts,
Mhm.
we know exactly how many cars are in each speed bucket. We can do it for this as well. It's just a little bit more complicated to do it that way.
And this slide, the next two slides, what you're looking at is how, so we've already filtered down to which streets we're looking at based on the slides she's already talked about. But the next few slides are different ways to look at the rankings based on different criteria. So this one
How
is,
they compare. to each other.
which are the deepest red ones are the ones with the highest volumes on them.
Yeah.
This map. And the next one will be about speeds and,
The highest volume is,
Speed.
yeah, so now we're,
so like the top speed is 47.
So instead of the threshold, you're giving us the full range.
yes, yeah.
Instead of the.
Yeah, so I used the cutoffs to isolate the streets and now I'm
Understood.
giving you the range.
Okay, thank you.
And this is crashes, so I used, join to take all of our crash data and, combine it with our street segment data. So each crash is linked to each segment, and these numbers here just show you how many crashes are linked to each segment. So between 0 and 69.
What is the period of time that we're talking about? So the crash data is for
I
a
believe
year,
this was 2017 and 2021.
27.
We had a segment that had 1,600 crashes on it.
Really?
So
Where was that?
2017 to 2021, is that the same for the volume and is that the same for speed as well?
No, so volume and speed is an average of 1 year of data, so those are both 2022.
Do you have a length of a segment? Do you have it broken down by how long a specific segment is?
I don't, not currently, so this is how we did it last time, but again, this is the kind of thing that was quite reasonable to do with big data because I've already got an attribute that says how long the segment is, and I've already got an attribute that says how many crashes there are, so it's just a matter of dividing if that's something that you want to do.
Is your thought that like a very long segment with 40 crashes might not be comparable to a very short segment with 40 crashes.
Well, I'm just thinking about like a specific neighborhood that is kind of a cut through, so it's not a long road.
Yeah.
But people are speeding through there, but it's probably a quarter of a mile.
Right. So normalizing by length might be one way to.
Yeah, it's certainly something we can
Well, but you normalize, but then sometimes we take out some of those that are short because they're short. But it's just as dangerous because it's a cut through. Does that make sense?
Even more so, right? So
Yeah.
the short, if the short ones are popping up on here and they're, relatively, it's more crashes per foot, right?
Yeah.
But one thing to keep in mind, so on here, the way it's visually represented, it looks like each of these is one long segment. But like the way we do it is anytime there's a road, like that's one segment, that's one segment, that's one segment, that's one segment. So it may look like it's only one, but it might be 4 or 5
We're just taking that.
individual segments.
So you can see that on that one because of the different colors in that same.
There's one, and there's one. You just can't really see it.
And crash count per segment.
And crashes are all equal? I mean, like a crash, a fender bender versus
Yes.
something that was an injury to a pedestrian or driver?
That was something that we thought about doing. The thing is that on the vast majority of these roads, you don't have injury crashes because they're residential roads. I don't know that we have any injury crashes or severe injury crashes. We may have a minor injury crash. So we didn't take severity into account. But again, that's something that we are calculating for other analyses. I'm currently, creating our high injury network and trying to attach what's called EPDO, which is equivalent property damage only, a way of taking a crash and putting it on a monetary scale. And so I'm currently calculating that for everyone. So it's not, it's definitely something that could be done. Like, for instance, in that scale, a pedestrian or cyclist crash is ranked higher than a vehicle-to-vehicle crash, even if there's no injury. So that might be something that is reasonable to think about doing here. So the next thing we did was we needed to take all of that data that is all on different scales and normalize it from 0 to 100 so that we can put it into one scale and it could be weighted how we want to weight it. So we took the observed value minus the minimum vol values divided by the maximal vol values minus the minimum vol values. Basically, what this does is it creates for us a scale from 0 to 100. I believe you have to multiply it by 100 to get it to 100, not 1, but that normalizes all the data. And that way we can put it into one thing and it weights the way you want it to weight. If we didn't normalize it, you couldn't add percentages and volume and get anything that made any sense, right? Because your volume may be like 1,000 cars per day, and then your percentages are out of 100, so you couldn't put them together in one measure. So
our final scores, the closer you are to 100, the higher priority you would be for traffic calming.
Exactly. So basically what we did was we took the speed percentile, and so we converted the 85th percentile speed to percentiles, which is a lot of gobbledygook, honestly, when you say it. But basically, for speed, everyone got a score of 0 to 100. And then we multiplied that by 0.4, so 40% of the score is speed. And then 20% of the score is volume, how many cars. So the car that had, street segment that had like 4,500 cars per day, they got 100. And then the one that had 200 cars per day, they probably got a 1. So that's kind of the way of ranking that. And then crash history, again, converted to percentiles, and that's 10% of the score. And then infrastructure, so if there were 0 sidewalks, they'd get 100. If they had sidewalks along the entire stretch of the corridor, they'd get a 0. And then percent minority, percent receiving benefits, below the poverty line, were all weighted at 0.083, which is basically combined, they make 25% of.
And if you're wondering why these very specific numbers, this is all exactly the same weights that y'all voted on for the last round of the team.
Almost exactly.
Yeah,
That's May.
that was back in May. That's right.
it's
Yep.
some slight tweaks here and there for mathematical big data reasons, but overarching, exact same stuff you guys, voted on already.
Just one more question about the side. I know you talked about sidewalk gaps being taken into account. You have to go, zoom in and go look. Is there anything else related to like the quality of the amenity? Right?
No,
So like
not-
if they're like totally degraded or they're very narrow and right next to the roadway,
So-
does that score the same as if it's?
It's not, however, as a part of our Athens in Motion plan, I just created a pedestrian level of traffic stress indicator, which basically it more closely looks at that, looks at buffers and crosswalks and that kind of stuff. So that is potentially something that you could substitute for sidewalks. You could substitute the pedestrian level of traffic stress if you wanted more nuance to it. In this case, I don't know if that much nuance is needed, but it's certainly not difficult to add if you wanted it.
And that's, seriously, part of this, we want to get your feedback on, are these the right criteria? Are they capturing the right data? And if not, we'll go back to the drawing board and see which, data we need to tweak. So for instance, should all sidewalks be created equal as we look at this? Or should some of them that are, separated from the roadway in better repair, that kind of thing, we can certainly try and take that into account if you feel like those are important measures. So.
In this case, only a third of the streets even have sidewalks.
I was gonna say, so if we.
So,
that
the nuance
skew it.
might overcomplicate things because most of your streets don't even have sidewalks.
Yeah, which is where the neighborhood calming is coming from that stress of walking in the street because you don't have the sidewalk. But I get it, and I appreciate the details that you were saying about the different criteria or grading of the sidewalks. One of the big issues that we have, especially with GDOT paving millage, is the sidewalk is now level with the street. The curb has just been, even less. So, so that's another stressor there, even when there is the little bit of green.
Bit of a buffer. Yeah.
Bit of a buffer, there's space, but you're losing that height, but.
Yeah.
Yeah, that corner of Barber and Prince that we toured is basically.
Oh, it's
just a
all,
ramp.
a lot of it,
But way back in the day, I was riding with our assistant director who just has very depth of knowledge. He was talking about how at one point there was some guy who had a connection who in courts. What is it that the
Court, you're talking about?
Is it the curbs that are in quartz? What are the curbs?
The granite.
Granite.
The granite.
The granite. And
Yeah.
it's got a really good deal on granite. And a lot of the sinking curbs are granite curbs.
Yeah.
Because they don't have the same durability as concrete.
Yeah.
So a lot of the curbs you see that are sinking into the ground, not the ones in the village, I don't think. But a lot of them.
No, some of them are, and that's, I thought that would make it easier to bring them back up, but I can see what you're saying is they don't have the base that happens when you pour the whole thing. But anyway.
So I guess their example, just to illustrate what I'm getting at, but not because it seems so the most important. Like there's a stretch of I think it's Chalfont up in Westchester, where there's pieces of sidewalk disconnected from each other, overgrown, dirty. So it's they're going to get credit for having.
Yeah.
Like they'll get a better score than no sidewalk at all, but it's a completely useless sidewalk,
The other thing about that is I'm using aerial imagery to find the sidewalk. It's that overgrown. I'm not gonna be able to see it. So I'm probably not gonna give them credit for that sidewalk, just because I won't be able to identify in the imagery that it exists. So
the components that you're using with the minority receiving benefits and below, was that the components that you decided on to try to address equity?
these are the equity components, and these are the ones you guys voted on.
Okay. So actually, even if you had done 0.24-ish, but you're breaking it down so we can see that.
I broke it down to show you that they're equally weighted against each other, and then together they make up 25%.
Okay.
And so those three components, they add up to 0.2, 4, or 5, right? What you're saying, where the crash history, there were 2.5 times more than the crash history, right?
And again, this is something you guys can play with. What part what should the equity weight be versus the crash versus the sidewalks, these numbers are actually fairly easy to tweak and play around with and look at how rankings would differ based on changing these things up.
Yeah, I'd be curious on that crash history, how it would, change things up, because there were places that had considerable number of crashes. And if that would change ranking as much, if that was doubled, for example, or, something along those lines, I'm just curious about.
And the other thing is, how many years of crash history do you want to include, right? So you could look at 5 years, 2 years, 10 years. We have 10 years of data, or we have 9 years of data.
Yeah.
So that's another thing you can think about is, do we want a larger swath of crash data so we have more data points to work from? There's a lot of there's pros and cons to both.
But you said that this is from 2017 to 2021 data,
Yes,
right, that we're using now, and you're saying it's possible to go deeper, just a little bit.
So are
Up
we,
to 2013 is the.
so is it, so will we be, if this, data driven model, if we're using it now, we're all good with it, would
And
we,
to clarify, we're not using this.
not using it, what are we doing?
We're talking about it, we're talking about.
Well, I'm saying if we used it, but what I'm trying to get back to is the streets that are not on this, what we're working on now, the ones we're going to do and when will we look at those other streets that might not have even made this list this time? I'm just trying to get it used.
There's a current list, and there's streets on this current list that aren't even slated to be worked on. If we go to this new model, will we lose those streets that are on this current list?
So you all voted to move forward with the top 16 or 17 streets with current funding.
Mhm.
A few months ago, you voted to move on those. The remaining streets that had been looked at, so there are 26 total that we looked at in last year. 17 of them should be addressed now with current funds. The remaining roads, we didn't have any plans to follow up with those. We would, because this is a transition year, we would finish the 16 or 17 that you voted to move forward funding on, and then we would move to whatever program y'all.
That's the question. So,
And which of those roads are on this, come on, in that, Joel, do
Okay.
most of those
Is that a
roads come through? Yeah, that is a question.
We can-
Maybe we could see that
My
next time.
understanding is that
We
that's
actually-
17.
We showed that.
Okay,
Okay.
The 17 are taken out.
we're getting there.
Sorry.
The
Right, but I'm
17
saying of the ones
will
that
be-
aren't,
will be
which are
taken
on
out
this
of it.
list.
Here we go,
There we go.
here we go.
I guess we just need to
Okay.
finish the.
Final score. And it's, it's hard to tell where things rank. So if we go to the next slide, this shows you the top 15. And I rank them in two different ways. The first way is using the average rank. So like I told you guys earlier, each of those long lines is made up of smaller lines. And each of those smaller lines has a different score associated with it. So one way to do it is to take all of those scores and average them, and then have a corridor project. The other way to do it is to say, actually, we want to address the road with the highest segment score first, and we'll take care of the whole neighborhood, but we want to look at the most dangerous segment. So that's this one versus this one. You can see that like 1 and 2, they stay the same, but Fairway Drive goes to number 3 for average. So across all of their segments, it's really high, but number 11 for highest because its segment isn't as high. And then Sunny Hills Drive, Old Monroe Road, Saxon Woods Drive, and Lombardi Road are 4 of the ones that are a part of that 16.
There's more than those 4 though, right?
I'm sorry?
That's the top 15.
That's
This is
in
the
this,
top.
this right, of those
That's
top.
top
You
15 of
see the
this
data
part.
of
this
In the
part.
data.
We
And I
highlighted the ones that overlap what you've already voted on.
Okay.
But
I
there's-
wanted to show that.
But the ones that we already voted on also included a few more that are not currently on.
Yes.
Yes, quite a few.
12 more.
All the other ones that are on that list are not on this list. So this is showing that there's quite a few roads that have speeding and traffic issues that we haven't currently identified under the current system for one reason or another, but that there are some overlaps. Like the program is still functioning, it's still finding roads that need to be addressed. So this is hopefully a more equitable way of identifying the roads, because it just looks at where are people speeding, where are there a lot more cars than just your average residential road. But I want Stephen to come up now and talk about some of the issues and dilemmas that we have and decisions.
Sure. Nikki, how are we doing on time?
Commissioner Myers?
How are we doing on time? It's
Well,
1:46.
We can continue to go as long as you want, as long as that.
Well, I want to make sure that this is obviously going to go more than this one session. And I know that I took a quick look at the animal services one, so I think we want to leave some time to go over that since you're here. And that's a very short presentation. So maybe we could go till, till 2 o'clock, another 15 minutes, have another 15 minutes here.
Sure, we got it.
So I think what's great, some of the conversation we've already had are identifying some of the issues that we need to be thinking about with the new policy. We will need to have maybe a few more meetings to actually get into the meat of the policy itself. But this is really important to start with. What data are we looking for? What type of program are we going to be using? So then we can write the policy based on that. What we found, and one of the most interesting things that we found was, in years past, it's a request-driven model. So you had, of course, people calling in from their specific neighborhood asking for help in that neighborhood. But we're finding roadways that meet all the criteria, but they aren't actually neighborhood streets. And so I wanted to bring this up as one thing to talk about. So the picture here is Jennings Mill Parkway.
Mm-hmm.
It is not a neighborhood street and it doesn't meet that eye test of people's houses along with driveways that go to it. What I considered is maybe a residential access road, because it leads to people's neighborhoods. It leads to apartment complexes. But in the past, this type of road would have been missed because nobody would have called and said, hey, I live on Jennings Mill Parkway. They don't. They live off of roads that lead to Jennings Mill Parkway. And there's a number of these that are just like this one. So I think I had a list that I sent over. It's on my computer.
International.
And that's a local road, not a collector road?
It's a local road.
Okay.
Is this the
Actually, Sarah, you'll go back to the list.
Which one?
Jennings Mill Parkway, AKA the 4-lane megatruck
Right.
highway.
Right.
That's a local road with residents.
So that Commissioner Thornton had asked the question at the very beginning, what's a local road?
Right.
Mhm.
So now,
So International Drive's another good example. If you can picture it, it's got a number of apartment complexes that lead directly to it. It's also got, I think, got a water treatment facility at the very top. But it wouldn't be considered. If I looked at it and thinking, am I looking at a neighborhood road? I would say no, right? It's not a neighborhood road, but it is direct access where people live, probably where people are walking. Cooper Road's another one, right? Where Cooper is a huge cut through on the east side. But it only has a few actual houses on the road itself. It just happens to be a road that connects to lots of little neighborhoods there. So
Research Drive.
yeah, so there's a number of these that I think we need to figure out. Do these types of roads, what we're starting to call residential access roads instead of neighborhood roads, should these fit into this funding source, into this program? Is this the type of road that you'd also like to put traffic calming on? Or do we truly limit ourselves to what we would traditionally call a neighborhood road, since this is the neighborhood traffic calming program?
And to clarify, when we say traffic calming, we probably wouldn't put something like speed tables on a road like that. Maybe traffic circles or chicanes, or some of the more horizontal.
What are the chicanes?
Chicanes are when you, when a road is very, very straight,
Right.
people tend to treat it like a freeway and they speed. So when you put a chicane, you kind of make the road go like this,
Okay.
and it helps slow people down.
It's
But
like
it
bumping.
doesn't, there's no bumps to
That
go.
was more fun to get past.
I know what you did in college.
Left all of the.
Spinning the wheel, yep. I wasn't gonna tell John, but she got you.
So and we don't have to come up with an answer today, but I
No.
think this is something that I'm thinking about. There's 4 or 5 of them that show up in just the top 15 that I would consider not your traditional neighborhood roads, but still access to residents. There's probably still kids walking between neighborhoods to, having to cross these roads. So, that's, I don't want to put values in your mouth here. I want you to think about whether that should be part of this list or not. So that's.
Would you define, Danielsville Road to Brooklyn, what you're talking about? Would that be an example?
So Berkland,
Come down on the other side where it says Danielsville to Berkland.
that's just showing which portion of Berkland.
But would you, because you have Danielsville, so I'm just wondering, because that's like a straight, but there's all these streets.
So
coming-
Danielsville is the road that you enter Berkland Drive from, and then it's like a loop, and then
But
you go back to Danielsville.
Yeah,
But Danielsville itself wasn't.
Danielsville isn't
Okay.
on it, but the
Okay.
road that's showing like the to and from point.
okay.
The segment.
Yeah,
Yeah. so
Beginning
it
and
starts where Berkland meets Danielsville, and then goes all the way up. Berkland.
Okay, so it's not going down Danielsville, okay.
and Stephen, back on the other roads that you were pointing out that question of, I think there's probably still a differentiation to be made. I mean, you used International Drive, but that isn't a cut through. That's just, there are just lots of apartment complexes. So you're only on there to your house. You're not cutting through. Where Cooper, you're cutting through,
Right.
So I think that's a little different. And the roads that are that's a Clarke County road. In a sense, it's in a neighborhood, right? And no one's gonna go in there and cut through somewhere. So I think there might be that's the apartment complex people are never gonna come in and get together and say, we need to do that.
So that could be a value identified as, is this road for residential access only, right?
Yeah.
Is there any other reason to be entering this road other than residential access? And
Yeah.
if not, then maybe that gets a higher priority. So that's the kind of feedback that's helpful.
What were the other,
Moss was another one that is a long rural local road that has, I believe, one parcel right there, one house, and the rest of it's farmland. And Crystal, you must know that area.
Yes.
Okay.
It's my road.
Okay. You're the one house.
There's two parcels, so there's three. But yeah, that is a bad road.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a lot
I
of
can
people
attest for that.
Oh, yeah.
will use Moss, right?
Great
to cut
transition.
between Spring Valley to Athens, right? So they will use it as a cut through, and it can be used as a navigable road, not just for residential, but there are 3 houses, being one of them. So
were there other challenges you identified? Didn't you?
We have 30% traffic calming over here. 30% vote.
So Sherelle, other challenges are you saying with the data part of it, or the?
Just make sure you went through the slides.
Yeah, the
Make sure.
slides. Is there another slide? Like, see that issue to address, right?
Mhm.
So that that's at issues.
Right.
Is there another issue?
Where's the next?
Oh, yeah, if you go to the last slide, I think
There we go.
Okay.
So this gets into our homework for next time, right? Which is really how we write a policy around this. And some of the questions that have already come up in previous meetings, like, what type of policy should this be? Should it be data-driven, as we're hoping it might be, versus request-based, which is like the old one? Should it be something where you opt in versus opt out, right? So the older model, you actually had to sign a petition and to get this approved. That's a lot of work on a neighborhood to come together and get a petition signed. So instead, should we have any kind of opt-in, or is there maybe the ability to opt out, where we send them the information and say, hey, you rank number 1 on this list. Here's a proposal for what we're going to do on your road. If you hate it and you don't want it, sign a petition that opts you out of it. Otherwise, we're going to assume that we're going to move forward with this project.
In May, didn't we lose a lot of the ones that were under consideration because of that inability to
Right,
come
right.
together? That's kind of why we're here
Yeah.
right.
that-
as
yes,
well, right? Okay.
So one of the staff's thoughts was, at least, we still want to hear the response from the community. We're not going to just assume that we know everything, but we don't want to make it a burden on them to say yes to something. Perhaps we can give them instead the opportunity to say no if it's truly something that they just hate. So that was the thought of maybe perhaps doing an opt-out model. We talked about how to add equity in with the data. And then one of the discussions that's going to come up is government funding versus neighborhood funding. This was something that when the CDO came through, this was a talk about, well, maybe there's not just one policy that we get out of this, maybe there's 2. And there's the one we just talked about was a data-driven model that's government funded. Perhaps we take the old policy and make it into a voluntary traffic calming program, similar to how we have a voluntary sidewalk program, if y'all have seen that one before, where neighborhoods who want to pay for sidewalks, they don't have to wait until Athens in Motion, until they get to the top of Athens in Motion list and said they pay for that sidewalk. Perhaps there's the ability to have a voluntary traffic calming for folks who may not ever get to the top of the list, but they still want to put in traffic calming on their roadways and they're able to pay for it.
So Stephen, the neighborhood funded model still requires administration, correct? Staff administration.
That's right. Yeah.
But how many people have we had apply for the sidewalk one?
We've had 2 so far and only 1 successful get through it off of Cleveland. So not much appetite. Not a lot of people want to pay for public infrastructure with $1 million.
Right.
And I mean, in that case, that was an HOA that
Yes, it was.
the developer who built it didn't complete the infrastructure, and so then they came through after and completed it.
So has this been sent to us? This just, okay. So for me, the next step is going to be absorbing this and going back on that note. And I made some notes that I think we'll have time to talk about next time as far as giving the absorbing. But I do appreciate the presentation and the details of it.
Well, our data guru over there.
Yeah, apparently.
Thank you.
So thank you, Cheryl.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I would just like to ask you at what point too, I mean, I am sort of interested to see how other data in here or changing the rankings, not the percentages, just with density, maybe it doesn't change anything. But, you know, with the population, you're talking about your road with 3 houses on it. If all 3 roads are meet those bottom criteria, but then they'd be ranked higher, right? And that road that had 300 people on it wouldn't get any boost because of the number of people. So I'm just, I would think that people would ask about that and say, wait a second, so the density and also the number of crashes, the percentage.
So when you say density, what you mean is the number of residences on the road?
Yeah. That's what I'm thinking about in some of the neighborhoods that might have, for example, multifamily on them and such.
Well, so one of the issues, I don't want to go over our time, but the residential access road's not going to have the people.
Right.
It's going to have a peripheral volume, but not actual addresses.
And that's covered in the number of cars. See, you got the number of cars ranking on there, but you don't have the number of people. And that's a perfect example. But I'm saying at what point will we maybe think about you guys where you want to, if there may be some other criteria that people want to look at, maybe it doesn't affect things. At what point do you want input on that to say, oh, we can just throw that in and show you there's not much difference, or there is?
But I thought we were working on what was voted on in May. I'm not sure that we can change that list.
I think ultimately, if the LRC would like to go that route, y'all can. Well, that's not what we're suggesting.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
What I did want us to do is kind of help Stephen and his team with the next meeting. So, he's got some questions about data-driven versus request-based, opt-out versus opt-in, equity in application. So, Stephen, what do you need at the next meeting? Do you need answers on those 4 things?
I would like to know what type of policy we're writing, and whether we're writing multiple policies, right? So those questions there, I think the first 2 questions are the equity in application. I think now we've baked that in. I think everybody's in agreement that there needs to be an equity score like the data-driven model has. The 2 models of data-driven versus request-based, do we want to have 2 policies? I think that's a question that needs to be answered. Do we want an opt-out clause for the data-driven model? That's another question. And really, if there are any criteria that you didn't see or that you didn't like from today, we would like to hear more about that as well, because I don't know if it's appropriate to send those questions and during this next month to us so that we can start crafting, to show you what difference. Okay.
It is. So I've got length, density, quality of the infrastructure, and possibly the severity of the crash. And then
And actually the one on that was the number of crashes, because we didn't have.
We have number,
We have number, we
not
don't have
severity.
severity.
Okay, that's fine, yeah.
I would be fine, since this is so much information, for us to be processing it and come to discuss this at the next one. I'm not sure that we need another slide. What are you guys thinking? I mean, because I think this is stuff we could
And just
develop a
throw this out
conversation.
there. So I am capable of calculating just about anything you want, but I will not always be in this role. So something to think about is, you know, how complex do you want to make the analyses? Because you want what has been done, I could train just about anyone to do. If you start making it more complicated, you get into having to hire out a consultant to do this work. To hire a consultant to do what I did, just this would probably cost $20,000. So do you want to, the more complex and the more data you add in, the greater the likelihood that in the future a consultant will have to do this work.
And the Social Security form.
So as you're, since you are the expert right now, are you able to create software that even later on?
I can program a Python tool, right, that can do a lot of this that you can sort of plug and play. But even that requires someone with fairly good geospatial analysis skills to use. It'll never be pure, but you'll have to be able to know how to get the data into the format that you need to be able to put it into a tool. So I could spend some time doing that.
So that's all
1/100th
something.
of my job. So.
Well, I'm definitely not trying to make it complicated. I really am not. I'm really not. Let's just keep it simple. That's real hard for some of us, but let's try.
And you had asked the one other question that needs to be answered for next time, I think, is that idea of neighborhood access roads versus neighborhood roads. So if you'll look, I think what would be really helpful, take a look at that list of 15 roads and just look at it on Google or drive it and tell us when you come back if you feel like all of these meet the type of road you want to be in this program.
Yeah, thinking about what's the purpose of the program and which roads really need to be included, and that can help us with
Crafting the next.
yeah, and I can send you guys a list of all the roads that qualify, and that would help with.
I think that would help, just for us to review that as we're going through here.
Sure.
And Stephen, they may not know if they should go with data-driven versus request-based. Is it possible for us to come back with some pros and cons of both?
Yeah, that would be good.
That's what I'm doing.
I would like to hear your all's pros and cons too.
Yeah.
Similarly with the government funded versus neighborhood funded.
And I would like to know what neighborhood funded dollars look like,
Commissioner, who has
if you would add that.
Yeah, just the one other question that I think needs to be tackled at some point is how do we transition from the way we were doing it, and especially the list of streets that are on that CDO, to the way we will be doing it?
This transition year.
Yeah, because like if I look at the list of streets on the CDO, there's, of the 17 listed, 10 of them are already being funded, right? And so there's these other ones that were part of the TBD quick build pilot. The idea is that this is kind of transitioning us to that. But only 3 of those 7 are on that list that you showed us. And so I think we'll need to discuss, well, what do we want to do with those ones that don't rank quite as high, but we've been kind of engaging with residents and carrying that through and even listing it in what we passed.
And the other thing about that too that I think is really exciting is that we're using what quote unquote quick build pilot materials. They can stay on the road for a very long time before they would need to be pulled up. So if neighborhoods wanted to keep those quick build materials, we may be able to just keep the quick build materials. That quick build materials, the way they're installed, they're meant to last for a long time. So we could, that's just an option, I guess.
Part of the transition, part of what you lay out for us. Let's wrap that up now so that we can go and talk about
Thank you.
pets.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you.
Sorry, I overwhelmed you all with data. I try not to, but
Thank you for showering us in data.
my little public health mind can't help it.
Mr. Myers, you know how to.
Yes,
We're ready.
Miss Moss Road.
I know, right?
Yeah, I cut through on Rankin.
Okay.
It's shorter.
Yeah.
So just a quick recap of where we've been. We have reviewed the animal control ordinance, specifically 4-1. We talked about the licensing and registration, pros and cons, if you will, case studies on Fulton and DeKalb. We said we were going to come back with a comparative analysis. Crystal's going to give us an update on that. Seemingly, it's been very hard for us to do that. We said we were going to do a vet survey. We've done that. We said we were going to do a resident survey. We've done that. And there was a question related to the vendors who are doing this and kind of some of the budget issues associated with that. We did some research. I don't think we came up with a lot on that, but I'll turn it over to Crystal.
Hey, how are you guys? Thank you. So this is just an update of the pet registration piece of the ordinance that we were talking about before. So we're going to talk about what we found from the comparative analysis. I went out and spoke to many of the local veterinarians, kind of give you an idea of what they said. And then Joseph, I think, is going to go over what kind of the public said. And then kind of you guys can know what your recaps and next steps and discussion questions. So the comparative analysis, I'll just be 100% honest. I think we do a great job of keeping data. There are not very many other counties out there that do that. I will personally thank Josh Edwards for that because he makes me do that as my person. So he's really a data-driven person, and so I have went down that road since I've become the director over there. Fulton and DeKalb, there just really wasn't any good feedback. I spoke to several of their people. They don't really have data to give me, so I don't really have good answers for you on that. I apologize. I just, and that's the honest answer that I got.
And do we have to be a program in Georgia for it to be a relevant comparison?
Say that one.
Does it have to be a Georgia entity to be a relative comparison?
Well, I mean, I was trying to compare kind of apples to apples.
Yeah.
I mean, I could absolutely go outside of Georgia. I mean, Florida, where I'm from, I mean, I can tell you most counties there do a registration program. So there probably is more data. Georgia, I think, is kind of coming into the registration program. So I just don't think there's a lot of counties that have data available. And the ones that do it don't necessarily do it well.
Right.
Well, so I think the way we want to do it, it's going to be the best way to do it.
Right.
Unfortunately, I don't think DeKalb and Fulton County do it the way it should be done.
Right.
So
if it's appropriate, I would like to learn a snapshot of I'm not surprised that you don't have any data in Georgia, but I know Louisville has one that is been bragged about to me. And then if you have some other, just a couple for us to understand how that is operating, where it is happening.
Yeah.
I think that would be worth
I
learning.
could follow up with an email.
That'd be awesome.
So.
If we could though, real quick, so if we could go through the entire presentation.
sorry.
If you want to do a deeper comparative analysis at the end,
Okay.
we will.
All right.
Yeah, that can be something
Good point. Thank you, Nick.
Yeah. So again, I think the way that we're looking at doing our registration program would be better than those other counties that are doing it in Georgia, but yeah, there's just not the data out there. So local veterinarians, essentially all the veterinarians that I spoke to will absolutely do whatever we ask of them to do. They want to be in compliance. They want to go with what the county wants them to do. I think many veterinarians I talked to have seen a registration program at some point in their career, whether they lived somewhere where there's been a registration program or they grew up with a registration program. It wasn't new to very many of the vets that I talked to. Most of them have had some form of it. Most of the veterinarians were definitely concerned on the taxing their staff. I did have a video that I sent to them from DocuPet, which is just one of the vendors that we would possibly utilize, showing how they go through the step-by-step. I only got feedback from one veterinary clinic, and it was kind of like, well, that's definitely going to be some extra work on our staff, which is true. There's no way that we can get around that. There's not an option for me to do it and not be any extra work on their staff. So it definitely is going to be something.
Hey, Crystal, sorry to interrupt.
No, you're fine.
When you use the term tax, you don't mean like actual.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
Taxation.
Yeah,
You mean
sorry.
burden. Work.
Yes.
The burden.
Workload.
Yes.
Sorry. So yeah, it's just, I know that was one of their larger concerns was the workload that it would put on their staff.
Can I ask a quick
Yeah.
question? I'm just trying to understand that chart.
Yeah.
Which I guess if you're in editing mode on the slideshow, you can shift it up a little bit to see the bottom, but that's just the names of the meetings, I guess. So what does that mean to have a bar that's closer to 2 versus closer to 0?
Yes, so as Crystal mentioned, overall response on the part of the vets was overall pretty positive, but this is just our attempt to kind of take qualitative information and kind of gauge the relative positivity of a response to a given question. And so it didn't really add a lot of flavor to what we learned from the vets. It was a small number of vets that were surveyed.
Okay. What number?
But generally, if you're total.
I think there were 6.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will say I reached out to every veterinarian in Athens-Clarke County, but I got responses from 6 that allowed me to come in. And I will say on the vet survey, it was not just a piece of paper with answers. I went in and had a conversation, but I asked all the same questions.
Yeah, so if you're approaching or exceeding 2 in your response, you're more positive in your responance than.
2 vets or 2?
The number 2.
Yeah.
I think each one of those is a vet.
Yeah, it's not really helpful to know.
Those are just the responses. Each set of bars is a different vet.
Yeah, so
Okay.
the questions are cut off, but yeah, the questions are color coded. So question 1 is that kind of light blue.
The closer it is to the top, the more favorable their answer.
Yes, thank you. What he said.
For 5 responses.
And each
Yes.
group represents a different vet.
That's right.
Yes. Yeah, and they
So
were,
there's just a color scheme.
as Crystal mentioned, they were all asked the same questions in person.
Yeah, I get it.
We had it was more of a conversation based.
Sorry.
Just a,
So it seems
They
like
didn't
the
know you
only
were-
really controversial one is the yellow question of would free lost pet returns to owners be a community benefit?
Yes, and that's an abbreviated question as well. Like I abbreviated all the questions to try to attempt to fit them in, which obviously that backfired horribly because you can't read them. But yeah, in general, that's the gist of that question. And
yeah, and I'll be honest, when I was talking to people, they're doing private veterinary medicine, so they're not really seeing any of the stray animals. I mean, they see them after they get adopted. So I don't know how much that really impacts them, but yeah.
And we heard in the meetings leading up to this, how important it was to hear from the vets, right? So Crystal has done a great job reaching out to all of them, and this is what we have received from them. So we wanted to make sure we showed that to you.
Thank you.
And then the next piece is, what did our residents say, which I will turn it over to.
yes, so we got the green light to go ahead with this survey, I believe, on the 21st. In conjunction, in discussion with the PIO, we elected to make it open for 1 week, so we had enough time to kind of aggregate and analyze the results to bring to y'all today. So during that 1 week period, we were well supported by the Public Information Office. They got the word out, to say the least. Local news outlets picked up on it, and we were kind of off the races. We got this is our highest responding community engagement to date. The prior high, I think, was 1,152 over 5 weeks. That was solid waste. It was a very extensive survey. I never thought it would have been beaten, but in 1 week, 1,440.
Let's talk about those furry family members.
furry friends.
So when asking the public if they supported pet registration, generally 55% rated it 1. If we took so 1 being the least likely to support registration, 10 being the most, the responses were pretty well clustered from 1 to 5. That encompasses about 70% of all the responses. And there was a cluster that rated 10, most likely to support. Around 200 individuals responded that they would be very likely to support. So I do want to mention that there was, there were some bookends, but the one bookend was significantly larger than the 10. As I mentioned here, 55% their opinion wouldn't change if we offered discounts or a free registration to low-income pet owners. It didn't really seem to move the needle much at all. which is interesting given some of the free text responses, which I'll get to in a minute. Similarly, most respondents overwhelmingly didn't feel that a registration program would foster responsible pet ownership, but there was a large cluster that felt it would. 309 individuals said it would versus 945 said it wouldn't. And then some answers in between. And about 66% didn't feel like pet registration would on its own do anything to reduce the number of strays. It was about a toss-up as to whether individuals felt that pets would spend less time in shelter if there were a registration program. In the qualitative responses, individuals alluded to the idea that a rabies tag is mandatory and that inherently is a de facto registration, as is a microchipping program. 804 out of 1,447 agreed to share demographics. The average respondent to this survey, 86% were identified as white, and about 60% were female, and the respondents were clustered mainly between the ages of 25 and 44 years of age. And then in the free text, this here again is another attempt at gauging sentiment from the qualitative information that we're able to obtain. We comparatively speaking, we said that about 59% of responses were strongly negative, 34% semi-negative, neutral. You can see we took up about a quarter of the pie there, and then positive, semi-positive, and excellent represent the last remaining 17% of responses. We do have all responses available, but that's something that you want to go through. But in terms of themes, as I mentioned, the presence of robust microchipping programs through vet offices was mentioned repeatedly. The idea that individuals perceive a pet registration program as another tax was something that was conveyed pretty frequently. And then kind of a disdain for government intervention and bureaucracy tended to take up most of the rest of the commentary.
Disdain.
The individuals. The individuals who felt positively about a potential pet registration program often mentioned that they had come from other jurisdictions where this was the norm. So I think around 200 individuals said, I came from X community or X state, and this was, I can't believe we don't already have this in place.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
The survey that went out, how much information did people get about the program before they started filling out the survey? Like, was it just kind of?
It was a paragraph about, what the survey essentially would, and I think we were pretty honest that there would be a fee involved because we thought that was important. The whole purpose of why we wanted to do it. And then kind of, like a paragraph, and then it kind of went into the question.
There was a
question about the cost of the fee, like at the beginning, because you didn't like.
It was in there, it was a
Yeah.
It was a question.
Yeah, and so I will, that's a fair point, Commissioner. That's probably one place where in the design of the survey, we dropped the ball. We initially had a slider where an individual could move that slider from 0 to 100. Any questions that are kind of a little bit novel, like ranking oriented questions, anything that requires an individual to do something a little bit novel, often it doesn't get a lot of traction. So at recommendation of the PIO team, we went to a radio button format where we chose $10, $25, $50, or I don't support pet registration. We should have probably also included a $0 option in there because there was a large proportion of individuals who indicated that they did not support pet registration, but kind of later on, they indicated that they might be in favor of it if there were a discount program in place, which makes me believe that some of those individuals at least would have chosen the $0 option if given the choice. So that is all on that.
I was surprised at that question. I thought it was very informative, being new to our last meeting and having questions. I think that you guys are like, well, maybe we should explain that. And so I thought it was very informative.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly does go into depth like I did with the veterinarian offices, but I think you gave enough information that, you know, people would be able to make an informed response.
You happen to know offhand whether and by how much people were favorable to a new funding source for animal programs?
I can give you that. I thought I had a link to the raw results in the top, but apparently it's not. Okay. Yeah, so there is a question that specifically refers to that.
I should have done it when I came in. I feel great. I turned it down.
Yeah, so 324 or about a quarter said they'd be very likely to support, and then about 49% said they'd be very unlikely to support, even if that funding were to be applied to newer existing.
What was the second number?
About 49%. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much in line with the 55%. I mean, it's pretty close. So that was what the resident survey said. So essentially at this point, it's just a matter of discussion next steps. Do you have any questions?
Do we want to go along? We have 10 minutes, 8 minutes. Do we want to just have a gut reaction to this and how we want to proceed? I mean, John?
I think we need to listen to our residents. I mean, that it sounds pretty overwhelming. They don't want it.
Okay.
And it's perceived as a tax. I don't think we ought to waste any more time, you know, doing more studies or other issues when we have other stuff we need to look at with our city. Just my opinion.
Allison?
Nikki, thank you. Now I know when I was asking those earlier questions, wait for the results.
Yeah.
I mean, I can support this coming out without action, but I would also entertain learning how it could be a voluntary registration. What I've learned in talking about this to people who have it is that in multifamily complexes, some places, they say if you're bringing a pet to live in this community, you need to have it registered. So it's not us making it mandatory, but it's available for communities so that when they're at the dog walking area or in this complex, everybody knows that it's vaccinated type thing. But that seems really complicated, but I don't know how having it available for those instances would be, but I definitely don't, I agree that the survey has said us trying to put it out there. It's not supported.
Ovita?
The survey has spoken. No.
Jesse?
Well, I don't know, I guess I'd prefer if colleagues are amenable to maybe sit on this for a month. I mean, we're just getting the results of the survey right now. Sometimes the right thing is not always the popular thing. I also think it's easy to have a negative response to something that's unknown. I mean, one of the things that we noticed is that people who've lived in cities that had this felt favorable to it. I mean, it might just be kind of one of those things where it feels kind of terrible to have to add an extra layer of bureaucracy or burden to your life to register a pet, but then once you're doing it, you realize it's actually not that big of a deal, and maybe even people start to experience benefits from it when they lost their pet and this benefited them. Before we did this survey, I thought staff made a really compelling case for why this would make a big difference for residents, for our pets, and for staff. I think I'm hesitant to completely drop it because of the results of one survey, even though it was a good response rate. And it also, it's not a super representative sample. I think Commissioner Thornton was joking with me that it's all my friends that filled this out. But, you know,
Whose age bracket? Their age bracket.
the demographics are a little, you know, for the people who chose to fill that out, that's not a very representative sample of
Well, I
overall
agree.
population.
I
So-
agree. When you say, but look, it was, how many females, white?
60% female.
How many?
I think 86% white, and then there was a pretty good chunk that also identified as prefer not to answer or something.
Yeah.
So it's,
They could
well,
represent, I mean, how do you get those other people? I'm not, how do you get the other people who are not white females and in that age bracket?
I'm without speculating on being able to be a better survey collector than experts who tried to do this.
Okay,
I think what I'm saying is, I don't want to take the results of one survey that we've just received the results from as like gospel to like immediately say, well, screw it, it's out, when I think a very compelling case was made for us to consider this beforehand. So I'd just like to take some time to be able to think with it.
Okay.
And, one thing that comes to mind for me over and over again is how unpopular seatbelt laws were. And now, I think people are pretty down with wearing seatbelts, and there's a lot of data to show that a lot fewer people die as a result of seatbelt laws. Similarly, anti-smoking laws were quite unpopular when they were first passed. But now, we just passed an expansion of our anti-smoking law, acknowledging the science behind it. And so I think if there's good, compelling reasons to do something that we really think is going to make a positive difference, the onus might shift from doing the best job to survey people up front to maybe us doing a better job of conveying to the public why we think this is valuable, perhaps before implementing it.
Okay, are we good? Okay, because it's almost time. I just want to make one comment myself too there. And that is, my gut feeling here is that I'm okay with holding it for a month for a quick discussion the next time. I haven't gotten real good evidence that it's going to make a difference, a big difference. We have companies who have a financial motive for pushing these kind of programs as well. And so that's something to consider. If there was some quick way to find out not how effective it is in changing behaviors and health of dogs, I don't think it's comparable to the smoking and the seatbelt here on this one. I haven't seen the data yet on that. It is a lot of people. That's almost as many people as probably, if we think about how many people elected each of us, it's equal to that number. It's a pretty significant number. And I have heard from that as well. So, and then the vet's saying it's extra work. So I'd have to get more compelling data to say it's worth it than we have right now. So where does this leave us?
Will you accept a motion to pass out without action?
I'd accept that motion.
and I second it.
Okay.
Okay. And we have a motion to pass this out without any action. We have a second. Let's have a vote. We're gonna be.
We're dropping
Yes, we're dropping it. So, John?
it. I agree.
Yeah.
No.
Yes. Okay. So the 4 have it to pass it out without any recommendation. And nay.
Make a motion to adjourn.
And a second to adjourn?
Second.
Okay. All right, thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
She told me to.
And
So
we'll do the next meeting date at another time.
Well, we'll do the next meeting date. We're getting back onto schedule with the next meeting date, right?
September 7th.
September 7th.
Thursday after Labor Day weekend.
Yes.
Oh, everyone said, ooh. I heard a couple oohs.
Well, I didn't know if that's what you're referring to.
Yes.